Of the trying long march, the Red Army makes light. Thousands of rivers and mountains are barriers slight. The 5 serpentine ridges outspread like rippling rills. The pompous Wumeng peaks tower, but like molehills. Against warm cloudy cliffs beat waves of golden sand. With cold iron chain bridge, River Dadu is spanned. Glad to see the Min range snow-clad for miles and miles. Our warriors, who have crossed it, break into broad smiles. It's July the 18th, 2016. President Xi Jinping is visiting Jiangtai Fort at the foot of the Liupan Mountains. He's come to pay his respects at the monument to the Union of the 3 Red Armies, the event that marked the end of the Long March. He lays a memorial wreath. Then he bows 3 times in honor of the fallen soldiers. In the Memorial Hall, President Xi examines the pictures and exhibits. He comments that the Long March was a heroic and epic undertaking. He describes the noble spirit of the Red Army as a vivid reflection of the revolutionary character of Chinese communists.
所以我到这里来啊，也是缅怀先烈，不忘初心，我们要走新的长征路，长征永远在路上，这是新的长征，这个当年的长征，我们这个中国共产党带领人民夺取政权的长征，新起点。那么我们现在改革开放新世纪2个100年的新长征，它都是接续进行的。 我们这一代人要走好我们这一代人的长征路。
Mao Zedong once said, "Since Pangu divided the heavens from the earth, and the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors reigned, has history ever witnessed a long march such as ours? For 12 months we were under daily reconnaissance and bombing from the skies by scores of planes, while on land we were encircled and pursued, obstructed and intercepted by a huge force of several 100,000 men, and we encountered untold difficulties and dangers along the way. Yet, by using our 2 legs, we swept across a distance of more than 20,000 li through the length and breadth of 11 provinces. Let us ask, has history ever known a long march to equal ours? The history of any great people contains tales of heroes and epic feats. The Chinese nation's rise to greatness, from the perils and humiliation it faced in the first half of the 20th century, is one such epic tale. The Long March was a series of epic journeys undertaken by various units of the Red Army between October 1934 and October 1936. Threatened with annihilation by Kuomintang forces, they were determined to preserve their strength and head north to confront the Japanese invasion. And so, the Central Red Army, the 25th Army Group, and the 4th Front Red Army, along with the main units of the 2nd and 6th Army Groups, left their bases. Led by the Communist Party of China, they embarked on one of the greatest military exploits in human history. Fighting at virtually every step, the Red Army marched for thousands of miles across a dozen provinces. They traversed surging rivers, climbed snow-covered mountains, and waded through deadly marshland. They broke through one blockade after another, pursued by hundreds of thousands of enemy troops, until the various forces met up in the Shanxi-Gansu-Ningxia border region in North China. From this stronghold, they launched a new stage of the Chinese Revolution. This magnificent achievement by the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army is known in history as the Long March. The Long March reached its conclusion in October 1936. To mark the 80th anniversary of this historic event, a CCTV film crew set out to follow in the Red Army's footsteps. The crew divided into 5 teams and drove tens of thousands of miles. During 2 months on the road, they recorded the miracle achieved by the Red Army 80 years ago. After 80 years, once bloody battlefields are now places of tranquility where flowers bloom. The elderly pass their time peacefully and children study quietly. But the Long March is not forgotten. It is still commemorated. Its spirit remains alive.
I叫王进群，1934年的10月参加250的长征。
我是凤六军团17师50团2月6年指导员杜凤健，
也就是陕西合川县人，14岁3、5月参加红军。
我叫杨光明，为什么叫光明呢？革命就是为了要走光明的道路。
跟你们经验
On April the 12th, 1927, on the orders of Chiang Kai-shek, Kuomintang forces began a massacre of their communist allies. Until then, the Kuomintang and CPC had been fighting together against China's northern warlords. In response to the Kuomintang attacks, the communists launched a series of armed uprisings. In Nanchang, communist resistance led to the founding of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. Elsewhere, in rural areas, a number of revolutionary bases were established. In the wake of his betrayal of the communists, Chiang Kai-shek set up a national government based in Nanjing. He then ordered his forces to surround the CPC bases. These encirclements were met with stubborn resistance by the Red Army. On September the 18th, 1931, Japanese forces launched the full-scale invasion of northeast China. Yet, instead of confronting the foreign threat, Chiang Kai-shek chose to continue large-scale military operations against the Red Army and its revolutionary bases. His refusal to resist the Japanese would plunge the nation into crisis. In September 1933, a 500,000-strong Kuomintang force launched the 5th Encirclement Campaign against the CPC's main revolutionary base in Jiangxi. At the time, the Red Army's effectiveness was being undermined by leftist dogmatists, and its situation became desperate. Eventually, the decision was taken to undertake a strategic transfer of forces. In October 1934, the CPC Central Committee and the Central Red Army left their main base in Jiangxi, and so the Long March began. More than 200,000 people belonging to various Red Army units set out on the Long March. The route they followed would be marked with blood and sacrifice.
我那个时间才很小，还没一个海洋枪高。红军的那个时间呢，不要啊，不要啊！我就跟着红军走，红军走哪里我就走哪里。走小路，走山，走，这个脚趾头没一个好的。
踩着雪里也得走啊，你不走上去啊？
头，专心的头，怎么样？靠意志。
爬山的时候允许我们拽马尾巴，拽到马尾巴就把我们带上山了。
那些战士照顾我，就像现在孩子啊，骑在他爸爸的背上，这么背着我。
说吃草根，把草叶子拿掉，把这草啊，嘴巴嚼这个汁，把这汁咽下去，那个渣在这吐。再困了，我不怕，坚决很想走的，决心不能掉队。前进就是胜利，走过去就是胜利。哎呀嘞，俺说就该管不就好。
Xinguo, in southern Jiangxi, is a famous name in the Red Army's history. Of the county's 230,000 residents, 50,000 joined the communist forces. Mao Zedong praised the people of Xinguo for their loyalty and personally inscribed the words, Xinguo Model Division. In all, 12,038 Xinguo natives, who were members of the Central Red Army at the start, would lose their lives in the course of the Long March. Liu Guangqian is 104 years old. He suffered a shrapnel wound to his right leg during the Battle of Gao Hunao in 1934. He counts himself lucky.
上船爬14人，走啥也14人，我这挺快也14人，这啥都不爱下去，这个事啊，闹这个哟，闹这个哟。
The wall is covered with the names of martyrs. Yet there are many more fallen Red Army soldiers whose sacrifices remain anonymous.
我们听到有这个事情，有个山头，这个山头一个连10几个人，这个山头，这个连一个都没上，最后救生员就把2面的土一干，把树这个连队完了。像这个山头的人过嘛，现在连名字都没有。
Such martyrs' tombs can be seen all along the route of the Long March. The locals risk their lives to erect these memorials. Many have no names on them, but people will never forget those brave soldiers who showed such loyalty to the Chinese workers' and peasants' Red Army. By November 1934, the Central Red Army had fought its way through 3 Kuomintang encirclements and reached the Xiangjiang River. 5 days and nights of heavy fighting later, they eventually broke through the 4th encirclement. It was the beginning of a long and bloody journey. Of 86,000 soldiers of the Central Red Army who left their Jiangxi base, scarcely 30,000 remained at the end. It wasn't only hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers they had to battle. High mountains and torrential rivers also took a toll of life. The ship of the Chinese Revolution was entering treacherous waters. But at the crucial moment, Mao Zedong came forward to retake the helm. A meeting, held in a town called Zunyi, saw a more mature CPC emerge, resolved to make its own decisions independently. To evade the pursuit of the Kuomintang, the Red Army crossed the Chishui River 4 times, carried out a skillful maneuver to negotiate the Jinsha River, and forced its way across the Dadu River. By climbing over snow-capped mountains and wading through vast marshland, they pushed northward until the 3 main forces of the Red Army triumphantly united. The Long March was a heroic campaign with the ultimate strategic aim of confronting the Japanese invasion forces. It was a perilous trek that would lead to the dawn of a new era in China. Never before in human history had there been a military expedition to rival it for the length of time it took, the distance it covered, the disparity between the 2 armies' strengths, and the ferocity of the natural environment it passed through. Even after 80 years, people are still fascinated by what was one of the most heroic episodes in the history of warfare.
天上飞机涨，地下劈刺刀，那是家常便饭。
长征路是怎么完成的呀？这是共产党的正确领导。
我把人交给党，一切生命交给党，我没有别的想法，私人问题根本没有考虑。
那时候没有动摇哦，还坚定不移地跟着共产党走哦。
长征没理想信念，连1000路也走不了。
In September 1935, after crossing the snow-covered Minshan Mountains, the Red Army reached the town of Bangluo in southern Gansu. It was there that Mao Zedong wrote his famous poem, The Long March. Of the trying long march, the Red Army makes light. Thousands of rivers and mountains are barriers slight. The 5 serpentine ridges outspread like rippling rills. The pompous Wumeng peaks tower, but like molehills. Against warm cloudy cliffs beat waves of golden sand. With cold iron chain bridge, River Dadu is spanned. Glad to see the Min Range snow-clad for miles and miles. Our warriors who have crossed it break into broad smiles. This was Mao's first and most vivid description of the Long March. In the preface to her book, The Great Road, American journalist Agnes Smedley wrote, "The Long March is unique in military annals. Compared to it, Hannibal's march across the Alps fades into the small theatre of the antique. And, whilst Napoleon's retreat from Moscow was a disastrous fiasco, the Long March was the prelude to final victory." British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery once commented that the Long March was an amazing feat of endurance. Mao Zedong himself said, "The Long March is a manifesto. It has proclaimed to the world that the Red Army is an army of heroes, while the imperialists and their running dogs Chiang Kai-shek and his like are impotent. It has proclaimed their utter failure to encircle, pursue, obstruct, and intercept us." Yet, outside China, nothing was heard at the time about the Long March. So tight was the control on information exercised by the Kuomintang that no one knew about the heroic exploits of the soldiers of the Red Army. Shortly after the Central Red Army crossed the Dadu River in early June 1935, CPC Standing Committee member Chen Yun vanished. He'd been sent on a secret mission that would take him first to Shanghai and then to Moscow. In the Russian capital, he would present to the Kuomintang a report on the Zunyi conference. On his way to Moscow, Chen Yun wrote an article under the headline "Account of Going West with the Army." Using the pen name Lian Chen, he had it published in the March 1936 edition of the French journal National Monthly. This was the first time the world would read a first-hand account by a participant of the Long March. Despite the horrors of the Long March, the Red Army always made winning hearts and minds its priority. The soldiers wrote slogans and distributed leaflets, informing people along the way about the CPC and Red Army's plans to achieve national salvation. It wasn't until the summer of 1935 that news about the Red Army began to appear in the world's press. By that time, the Long March was approaching its victorious conclusion. On August 5, 1936, soon after his arrival in northern Shanxi, Mao Zedong issued an instruction to the political department of the Central Red Army to the effect that it should set up an editorial committee to collect articles and reports written by members of the Red Army about the Long March. The response from the soldiers was enthusiastic. Within 2 months, some 200 articles had been submitted, totaling more than 500,000 words. Based on these, a book, The 25,000 Li, was published in February 1937. For the second edition, the title was changed to Account of the Long March by the Red Army. Many of the authors of the articles would later become New China's founding fathers and leading generals. In October 1934, Red Army General Xiao Ke met British missionary Rudolf Bossart in a church in Jianyuan, Guizhou Province. Bossart would accompany the 2nd and 6th Army groups for the next 560 days as they battled their way across Guizhou and western Hunan. After returning home, Bossart wrote a book, The Restraining Hand. It was the first account by a Westerner of the Red Army and the Long March. Their amazing passion, pursuit of a new world, and devoted fidelity to their faith is unheard of. In June 1936, an American journalist set out for the Shanxi, Gansu, Ningxia border area. He'd heard a great deal about the CPC and Red Army, and he had many questions he wanted answered about the Chinese Revolution. The journalist's name was Edgar Snow. This photograph was taken by Snow. For the first time, the world saw the image of the communist leader, Mao Zedong. Snow met numerous Red Army soldiers during his time in northern Shanxi. He later commented that they were the finest men and women he had ever encountered in the 10 years he had spent in China. One day, he said, someone was sure to write the full epic of their remarkable expedition. Edgar Snow published his famous account of the Red Army and the Long March in the UK in 1937. Red Star Over China became an international bestseller. The following year, a Chinese edition was published in Shanghai under the title Traveling to the West. Edgar Snow forged lasting friendships with Mao Zedong and other Red Army leaders. Mao met Snow 4 times after the founding of New China. The Chinese leader praised Red Star Over China as one of the best accounts of the Chinese Revolution written by a foreigner. The influence of Edgar Snow's writings brought other foreigners to northern Shanxi. Among them were the Americans Harrison Foreman, Theodore White, Agnes Smedley, and Anna Louise Strong, the British journalist James Bertram, and New Zealander Rewi Ali. They would write their own accounts of what they saw and heard, helping the world to learn more about the CPC and its Red Army.
The story of China is a story of change. We tell the story because we believe what happens here makes the world different every day.
Life is a journey of discovering different perspectives. We are young, open-minded, and dynamic. We push the envelope and think out of the box.
CCTV News is one of the voices in the world, and our voice is new and loud.
I am from America, but I live and work in China. Great powers have big stories. CCTV News is watching closely.
I like sharp but informed opinions. Television is not just a show. We deliver a voice of reason through balanced dialogue and very tough discussions. We believe ideas matter.
One for All, China 24.
Culture Express. See the world in color.
On August the 1st, 1935, the CPC published the Message to All Compatriots on Resistance Against the Japanese and National Salvation. The August the 1st Declaration, as it was known, prompted students in Beijing on December the 9th, 1935, to launch patriotic protests against Japan. A week later, on December the 17th, at a meeting in Huayabu in northern Shanxi, the CPC Central Committee adopted the Resolution on the Current Political Situation and the Party's Tasks. The Huayabu Manifesto, as it is called, contained a key proposal, that of establishing a broad united front to resist Japanese aggression. The Xi'an Incident of December the 12th, 1936, was a turning point in the formation of this front. Kuomintang generals Jiang Xueliang and Yang Hucheng, having secretly allied themselves with the Red Army, forced Chiang Kai-shek to agree to the Kuomintang forming a united front with the Communists against the Japanese. On July the 7th, 1937, Japanese forces attacked the Chinese garrison at Wanping near the Lugou or Marco Polo Bridge on the outskirts of Beijing. In the wake of what would become known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident, the Japanese launched a full-scale invasion of China. The Red Army, reformed as the 8th Route and new 4th Armies, became the backbone of the National Salvation movement. Even as the anti-Japanese war intensified, accounts of the heroic Long March continued to spread, by word of mouth as well as in writings and pictures. In 1938, Sketches of Going West was published in the concession area of Shanghai. The artist responsible was Huang Zhen, head of the Red Army's publicity department. In 24 sketches covering the entire route of the Long March, Huang brought vividly to life the Red Army's heroic spirit. Inspired by such accounts, young people in their tens of thousands flocked to the communist base at Yan'an. These sons and daughters of the Chinese nation, as they gathered beneath the hilltop pagoda, would sing patriotic songs that reverberated across the Yanhe River. Typical of their sentiments was, "The people's liberation and the nation's salvation we bear on our shoulders." Mao Zedong said, "The Long March is also a propaganda force. It has announced to some 200 million people in 11 provinces that the road of the Red Army is their only road to liberation. Without the Long March, how could the broad masses have learned so quickly about the existence of the great truth which the Red Army embodies?" On October the 1st, 1949, in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, the founding of the People's Republic of China was declared. Many of those present, either standing on Tiananmen Gate or in the square in front of it, were veterans of the Long March. The occasion marked the beginning of a new chapter in Chinese history. Now, another long march was beginning, one for building the country. However, the challenges facing New China were enormous. The country was emerging from the devastation of war and was suffering under an imperialist blockade. The Chinese people, in their efforts to eradicate the widespread poverty and build their country, drew inspiration from the spirit of the Long March. On the eve of Army Day in 1951, the opera The Long March was premiered by the Beijing People's Art Theatre. The spectacular performance recreated the heroic exploits of the Red Army on its Long March. For the first time, the image of Mao Zedong was seen on stage. The opera was created by Li Bozhao, a publicity officer with the Red Army's General Political Department. In 1957, to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the PLA, its General Political Department called on people across the country to write down their personal accounts of the Long March. In all, some 10,000 articles were submitted, which were compiled in 10 volumes. Mao Zedong personally inscribed the title of the collection, The Spark That Triggered a Prairie Fire. The third volume, of what is the biggest compilation of war memoirs ever published in China, covers the Long March. The volume contains 78 articles, written by 72 authors. In 1959, the August 1st Film Studio released a film that would have a profound impact across China. Thousands of Rivers and Mountains was the first movie ever produced on the theme of the Long March. The film was an adaptation of a play written by Long March veteran Chen Qitong, a publicity officer with the 4th Front Red Army. For decades, the heroism and humanity of the Red Army soldiers on the Long March have been a theme of artistic and literary creation in China. As such, they've been unrivaled in their power to move people. A simple saying has inspired millions of Chinese people to be self-reliant and overcome every manner of hardship. That saying is, if you think it's too hard, think of the Long March. A great nation always honors its heroic spirit. Over the past 80 years, a unique Long March culture has developed. More than 2,500 books have been published on the topic and hundreds of documentaries, films, and other works produced. The Long March has become an incubator of ideals and beliefs. Its spirit has, over the past 8 decades, proved to be fertile soil for growing revolutionary seeds. And those who have nurtured that spirit and seen it flourish have become pillars supporting the country socially, economically, and ideologically.
同学们，读完了这一段，让我们再来回顾课题：飞夺泸定桥。大渡河所昭示的红军团结一心、不怕艰难险阻、勇往直前的英雄气概，已经沉。
The author of Capturing the Luding Bridge was Peng Jialun, a publicity officer with the Central Red Army during the Long March. The article has been committed to memory by generations of Chinese children, having been selected for inclusion in primary school textbooks over 30 years ago. Today, the route of the Long March is marked by ruins, historic sites, monuments, and cemeteries. Across the country, there are numerous streets, squares, and communities, all named in honor of the Long March. Places where the Red Army passed through and fought battles are regarded as sacred. People of different generations flock to them in search of spiritual sustenance. While following in the footsteps of the Long March, the CCTV film crews met many ordinary people who were on their own personal odysseys to discover the true spirit of the Long March. Setting out in October 2013, photographer Zuo Li spent a full year covering the entire route. He published a book, A Person's Long March, based on his experiences. Now he tours the country, giving lectures.
美国著名的作家索尔兹伯里也曾经说过，长征是一个什么样的历史呢？是超越了国界，超越了民族，超越了各种意识形态的精神远征。他们一致认为，长征不简单的是中国的，长征是世界的呀。
In 1984, at the age of 76, veteran American journalist Harrison Salisbury set out to follow the route of the Long March. The result of his journey was The Long March, The Untold Story. When it was published in October 1985, the book caused a sensation in the US. In it, Salisbury wrote, "It will be inappropriate to compare the Long March with anything else. It is unique. Its heroic spirit has inspired the nation of 1.1 billion people and urged the country to move toward a future no one could predict." The Long March has bequeathed a monumental legacy to humankind. It not only changed the fate of China, it also transformed the whole world order. It broke through the fog and darkness and lit up the way to survival and emancipation for people all around the world. On August the 1st, 1965, Army Day, the choral concert Songs of the Long March premiered in Beijing. The composer was General Xiao Hua, a Long March veteran. To date, several generations have grown up, inspired by his passionate depiction of the Long March. On October the 16th, 1964, China conducted its first successful testing of an atomic bomb. When the news reached Beijing, the Great Hall of the People was filled with jubilation. The event was marked by a performance of the music and dance spectacular, The East is Red. The East is Red eulogizes the great history of the Chinese Revolution and the CPC's leadership. The most carefully devised scene in the show focuses on the Long March. In the words of Mao Zedong himself, the Long March is also a seeding machine. In the 11 provinces, it has sown many seeds which will sprout, leaf, blossom, and bear fruit, and will yield a harvest in the future. In a word, the Long March has ended with victory for us and defeat for the enemy. Today, the Long March is widely credited as one of the greatest military expeditions in human history. So how did this great odyssey start?